American Psycho is known for the book by Bret Easton Ellis and the movie released in 2000, but the franchise is much larger than most people realize. Patrick's first appearance is in the book Rules of Attraction, and he's also in the books The Informer and Glamorama. American Psycho, the novel, has also been adapted to an audiobook, a stage play, and a Hungarian book called Budapest Schizo. The movie got a sequel called American Psycho 2, All-American Girl, directed by Morgan J. Freeman, which isn't actually a sequel at all, but instead is a completely unrelated movie that Lionsgate renamed to American Psycho 2 in the hopes that more people would see it, because it is a really awful movie. But what I'm here to talk about is something that little people, even fans of American Psycho, are aware of. There is an actual sequel for American Psycho called American Psycho 2000. This released in the year 2000 as a series of emails sent from Patrick Bateman to you. Hey, I forgot to record this bit originally. I also wanted to mention that this technically wasn't written by Bret Easton Ellis. It was written by an author who's anonymous, but all the emails were edited and approved by him. So for that reason, I think it could be considered official. Because I was really interested to see this, because the original American Psycho was a parody of 80s yuppie culture, but now we're seeing Patrick in an entirely different decade. So how would this character have developed over those 11 years? I think the very first email starts off in an interesting way. I'm going to directly quote how it starts. My problem came from being a young man with a lot of money in Manhattan. As a direct result of my position and perceived good fortune, the word no did not apply to me. Can I have this suit? Can I have this phone? This girl? Yes. This drug? This apartment? This deal? Yes. This car? This table? This stretch of oceanfront? Yes. Could I change the boundaries that define society? Could I create my own set of rules and live by them? Yes. Yes. Everything but no. Was I searching all this time for someone who would finally say no to me? Now this is a really interesting way to start it off, because Patrick Bateman in the original would never say something like this. So this shows that he's changed a lot over the 11 years. In the book, when Patrick Bateman inner monologues, it is usually just to say about something he hates or despises. But we never see this kind of introspection in the original. So I'm going to walk through the plot of American Psycho 2000. There's two main plot threads. One plot centers around Patrick's personal life, and another plot thread centers around his professional life. In the plot about Patrick Bateman's personal life, we found out that pretty soon after the events of the original, he began dating Jean. If you don't remember, in the original, Jean is Patrick's secretary, and they have an interesting relationship, because Patrick Bateman was originally going to kill her, but then after meeting her, he realized that she's not nearly as vapid and materialistic as everyone else. And he came to genuinely like her. And when you think about it, it's actually kind of a sad scene where he chooses not to kill her. Where this is probably the first time in years, maybe ever, that Patrick Bateman actually liked another person. And he just tells her to leave because he thinks he's going to kill her if he's alone with a room with her for long enough. But they do date and eventually get married. And they even have a kid named Patrick Bateman Jr., which Patrick refers to as PB. Now I'm sure the first question people have about this is Patrick still killing? And the answer is no. In this, he never actually directly mentions that he killed people, but he does somewhat imply it. He never said that he regrets the murders, but he just says that this is part of his life that's behind him, and he's no interest in pursuing it anymore. But about 2 years prior to when this starts, Patrick is actually getting divorced to Jean. In his mind, he says that Jean has changed, and when he first started, she was the only real person that he knew. But now, after being exposed to Patrick Bateman for so long, she's become just as materialistic and centered around money as he is. Of course, one thing I find interesting about this is Patrick's relationship with his son. In that, if you take all the emails on face value, he seems like a kind of a good father. There's an entire email where he talks about the importance of setting boundaries, but he really adores his son. He goes, whenever he mentions the son, he goes on long rants about how this is the greatest child. If Jean had a child with any other man, he wouldn't be nearly as great as PB. He is so much more intelligent and amazing than all the other of his pupils. When this starts, Patrick Bateman begins seeing an online therapist, because he and and he explicitly says to the therapist that he's going there because he believes that seeing the therapist will improve his chances of getting custody of his son in the divorce. And he explains to the therapist that he believes Jean is using his son as a pawn in their divorce, where he believes that she is withholding custody of her son to get a larger alimony. And he's pretty explicit that what he wants from this divorce is just to get the most assets. He even calls the divorce a competition, at one point even recommending to his therapist that she read Sun Tzu's Art of War to better understand his divorce. Now, the way I see it, I think there's two different ways you could interpret this storyline. The original very heavily uses the trope of unreliable narrator. If you don't know what unreliable narrator is, that means that the story is entirely from Patrick Bateman's perspective. But as American Psycho goes on, the original, you begin to question more and more Patrick's sanity, and for any given scene, there's no way of really telling whether whether what you're seeing is a delusion Patrick is having, or whether these are actual events occurring. I'm not sure whether or not American Psycho 2000 uses the unreliable narrator trope. So interpretation 1 is when you think that Patrick is a reliable narrator. If Patrick is a reliable narrator, then he's a good father, and he's trying to get custody of his kid from his wife, who's withholding it from him for money. Or if you believe in interpretation 2, Patrick is an unreliable narrator, and possibly he's not actually as good of a father as he says he is, and the reason Jean is withholding PB from him is for PB's own well-being. And there's really no way in the story to tell which one is true. It's more up to interpretation, just like in the original. The second plot centers around Patrick Bateman's professional life. In it, we find out that some time ago, he left the company he was working at before, due to what he just refers to as the issue, and he also states that everyone agrees it's best if this issue is not made public. Then in the email, right after mentioning the issue, he mentions Paul Allen's disappearance. So it's implied that this issue that they're referring to is actually the fact that Patrick Bateman killed Paul Allen, and the company found out about it, but for PR reasons decided not to tell anybody. So now that Patrick Bateman no longer has his previous job, he's pursuing this new venture. So the second plot revolves around the wealth of someone named Davis Ferguson. Davis Ferguson is this venture capitalist from the Midwest who Patrick knows is illegally holding onto a lot of money. And so Patrick has hired essentially a small army of private investigators to try and find ways that he could acquire this money. Eventually, the private investigators tell Patrick that Davis Ferguson has a son named Terry Davis, not to be confused with the guy who made Temple OS, and that Terry Davis has basically been disowned by his father, because Terry Davis basically just spends all day taking money out of his trust fund to do drugs and have gay sex. Eventually, the private investigators find out that Davis Ferguson was avoiding taxes by putting all of his illegally acquired money into Terry Davis's trust fund, meaning that technically Terry Davis owns the money. Now, Patrick doesn't just want the money. He also wants a holding company owned by Davis Ferguson called the Trade Corporation. So here is how Patrick acquires all of that. Patrick enlists the help of a man named Simone Del Revni. Simone is this incredibly attractive homosexual man who Patrick gets to swoon Terry Davis. Then Patrick informs Terry Davis that he is actually in control of all of Davis Ferguson's wealth. When Terry Davis tells his father that he is actually in control of all of his wealth, his father is furious. He goes to sit down, but instead of sitting on his chair, he accidentally sits on a glass table. And he's a very overweight man, so he shatters the table, and then one of the glass shards hits his artery, killing him. And because Terry Davis is in the will, Terry Davis gets ownership of the Trade Corporation. And then Patrick Bateman uses Simone to buy that corporation on his behalf. Now, going back to the personal life plot, Patrick and Jean are separated, and PB spends most of his time with Jean and her new boyfriend. Now, Patrick and his son go to see a movie together, But then his son says that he wants to take the bus. And there's this funny scene where PB shows the bus token he has to Patrick. And Patrick doesn't know what it is. And then Patrick takes a bus for the first time in his life. At first, he's like disgusted and infuriated that his son would be taking a bus. But then, over time, he actually respects his son more for it, that he's taking this sort of independence. And is sort of just being more of a real person than Patrick. Eventually, through talking to the therapist more, Patrick admits that he doesn't really view other people as people, and he views people more as objects. He views everyone in his life either as a tool to get his own purposes, or he just views them as a single characteristic and not a complete person. Like, he can only see Jean as this evil woman, and he can't see her as anything else. And he can only see his son as this idolized Greek god, and not just like an actual kid. And he also admits that a lot of his problems stem from him trying to control everyone in his life. He even admits that the only reason he married Jean was so he can control her more. And it seems like he's making progress. But then he somewhat falls into bad habits, because he gets Jean to see his therapist in the hopes that his therapist would break confidentiality and tell him what Jean says so he could use that against her in family court. Now, obviously that plan doesn't work, and he leaves his therapist furious that that they wouldn't help him with this plot. So in the very last email, the way it ends is Patrick now owns the Trade Corporation, and the Trade Corporation includes a movie studio. And it ends with him going into the movie theater to watch the first movie the studio releases since he acquired them. He sits down. There's a white background, and harp music gently starts playing. Then red drips start coming from the top of the frame. So it's a very strange ending. The ending reveal basically being that the movie American Psycho was made by Patrick Bateman from the book, based off his own life. Which is a very strange way of doing an adaptation. So what did I think of American Psycho 2000? Yeah, I found it enjoyable to read. It was pretty alright. I think it was best in the parts where the plot was moving forward, but most of the emails are not really plot related. And really, American Psycho 2000's weakness is it does not have the sharpness of writing that the original novel had. Now, strangely, this isn't actually the last official appearance of the Patrick Bateman character. Bret Easton Ellis also wrote the book Luna Park, which is a fictionalized autobiography of his own life. And in it, Patrick Bateman is a character in Bret Easton Ellis' life. And I'm not really interested in reading the book, so I'm not going to. But according to Wikipedia, he dies at the end, so bye.